and welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe who offer exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance that help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hello, my name is Alistair Bryce-Clegg and I'm your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm an early years consultant, trainer and author. Now, throughout this series, we will be discussing a range of topics that are aimed at supporting best practice in the early years and inspiring you with guidance and resources that will really enhance your practice. So I'm delighted to introduce today our guest, Neil Leitch. Good morning, Neil. How are you?
Yep, it's pretty busy at this particular point in time, Alistair, but it's sunny, so I'm okay today.
I can imagine, as we'll talk about in the podcast, this is a really busy and crucial time for what's going on in the world of early years. But before we get started, for anybody who doesn't know who you are, couldn't you give us a brief introduction of who you are and why you're here today?
So I'm the Chief Executive of the Early Years Alliance, which is a membership organisation representing about 14,000 nurseries, preschools, childminders in England. The one thing I think that's different about us, Alistair, is that we are, as well as being a membership organisation, we're also a provider of young children's education and care ourselves. We operate around 41 settings, exclusively in areas of deprivation. Yeah. Interestingly, this time 4 years ago, we operated 132. So I'd like to think that when we talk about some of the challenges of the earlier sector, frankly, we do it first-hand experience.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because if you're within the sector, I'm going to talk about that across our episodes. We are in a state where I think our sector is very undervalued. I think there's a lot of pressure on the staff that work within our sector. We have issues finding a good, strong workforce. And therefore, we need to take advice from people who are actually doing the job and appreciate what the issues are, as opposed to some advice that you get from people who don't necessarily understand what it is the issue is. And therefore, it's a little bit harder to take. But we've got 4 episodes to dig into, and we're going to start with the first one. We're going to talk about what's in the news very much at the moment, and that's the early years funded hours. And also just that question of, is it possible? And if it is, what does a good model look like? And what should we be asking of the government in terms of this rollout?
I'll try and remain reasonably positive, at least to start with, if I can say that. I mean, yeah, I think anything is possible, but it's about will and it's about application. And I think the concern that we have at this particular point in time is that, as government rightly says, it's the biggest initiative that they've launched. Literally, in all the time I've been involved in early years, I've never seen anything quite like it. But I think it's important to understand why it was launched, and how it was launched. And it is interesting, of course, that it's launched against a backdrop of where we've had record-setting closures, where we have a recruitment and retention crisis that, frankly, we have never witnessed before. And we were also excluded from any of the discussions. So again, being the largest membership organisation in England, I find it interesting that we got to hear about these announcements 10 minutes before the Chancellor stood up in Parliament and made this particular investment. Now, I should have said right at the beginning, my background isn't early years. I am not qualified in early years practice, child development, behaviour. My background was finance. I used to chair the Finance Industry Standards Association. I'd like to think, that was about 20 odd years ago, I'd like to think that I developed a moral compass because I semi-retired from that particular sector and volunteered for the Alliance and do more than ever. But my point is this really, is that if you were in business and you announced the biggest product that you're ever going to launch and you had no conversations with your production director, your sales and marketing director, your retail outlets, I think you'd be sacked. But somehow when it comes to early years, it's absolutely fine. And so the challenge is enormous. And we're surprised now, Alistair, that we've got a position whereby settings are saying, we can't deliver this. We are struggling. Parents are on waiting lists for years. So if there's a will, it could be done, but not on the current investment or the current basis.
And again, try to stay a little positive. It's really hard not to be cynical about where these ideas come from, and that a lot of what our education system is based on is not about well-being of children. It's not even about child development necessarily. It's often about government strategy and government targets, regardless of which government is in place. But yet, it's the people who are listening to this podcast who are ultimately affected by those changes. And I think, often I talk to lots of people, and I do conference work, and there's a real passion in our workforce, and there's a real desire for change. And you often hear a rallying cry that says, come on, if we all get together, we can make a difference. And we've got things like the Alliance, which are groups of people who are getting together to try and make a difference. I suppose the hard bit of it, the sad bit of it, is we keep coming up against this absolute wall that, even though there is this passion for it, even though we have got armies of people who are advocating for children, it feels like, as you've said, major changes made without consultation, but yet we are in the position of having to put that change in action.
Absolutely. I mean, Alistair, it is interesting. When the Chancellor made that announcement a year ago, the only reference that was made to a child was to change the adult to child ratios. And that was against, of course, as you will be well aware, and the listeners will be well aware, that was against a backdrop of overwhelming opposition from both parents and the sector. So there is no interest in what the sector says, and that's demonstrated by the actions that are taken. And I also find it, and I've said this in recent times, I don't recall in the last 5 years, frankly, ever having a conversation with a senior government official, whether it be the minister I've met, both chancellors, Secretary of States, where anybody has ever asked me, Neil, what do you think might be in the best interest of our workforce? What do you think might be in the best interest of the child and their family? And I'm slightly uncomfortable that every time I hear an interview at this particular point in time from those who have the stewardship and the responsibility for the well-being of our youngest children, i.e. ministers, Secretary of States within the education department, they never talk about the child. It's all about mums back into work, how much we can improve the economy if we get more mums back into the working environment. That may be me, it may be my naivety, but I would have thought it's not unreasonable for those individuals to be talking about what's in the best interest of the child. Let Treasury do their job, but your job is our children's development and education.
And it's not going to be a government bashing podcast, but I think the truth of it is that the knowledge about children and child development doesn't exist within the remit of the policymakers, and yet it should, because there are plenty of people out there who'd be more than happy to share their expertise and to share their knowledge. And again, if the groundswell within the community of early years practitioners is very much against a lot of these principles that have been put into place, which sound great for parents. You're going to get some free childcare. It's going to be fantastic. And yeah, it's great if parents want to get back to work. We need to enable that to happen. But not if that childcare is at the expense of settings that are closing down, or you get a watered down or bridged version of childcare, or the mental health and well-being of the childcare community. And I know from visiting settings, which I do on a regular basis, the level of stress, not only of the people who are working with the children, but also the people who are trying to manage the people who are working with the children and fill the absences and make sure there's enough bodies in rooms. So when you're thinking about child development and childcare, where you've got that really high quality, I can invest a lot of time and effort in you and your development as a child, is very different to when you're saying, I can't cover this room, we're going to have to put 2 rooms together or close. So that high quality development that parents think they might be getting is beginning to get watered down and thinned because there just isn't the capacity to deliver it.
Absolutely. I mean, we've just carried out some research in terms of why it is that people are leaving the sector, and there are 3 factors. One is that they feel undervalued, and particularly, I have to say, whilst it's not just about government, but government is named as undervaluing them more than any other area. Exhausted, and that's because of the fact that we have a recruitment and retention crisis. They're having to work more hours. We are starting to see more children presented with personal, social, and emotional development needs, etc. And of course, they are underpaid. And interestingly, it is in that order. So undervalued, exhausted, and underpaid. And there's a reason why I think I'm hauled up almost every single year in front of the Low Pay Commission to explain why it is that our people are at the bottom of the pile when it comes to earnings. And as you've alluded to, when I talk to people and I ask them why they're in the sector, they don't talk about a balance sheet, a profit and loss account, EBITDA, return on capital investment. They use words like, I love children. I want to change their lives. I want to support them. And as somebody, I know I have grandchildren. My children are sort of grown up, but the reality is if you ask me what I would want from somebody that was going to care and educate my child, they are the qualities, not fiscal. They are the qualities that I would want. So, yeah, it's the entitlements, to come back to your original question, the entitlements are going to be a challenge against the backdrop of an infrastructure that feels difficult. And I think I'm putting it lightly there.
Yeah. And I think if we are talking about how we can support people who are listening to this, who are like, yes, I completely agree with everything you're saying, but like, so what can we do? Where can we go? There are two elements, I suppose, for me. And one is that kind of lobbying the government, which is a much more difficult, much longer kind of, a long game in terms of being able to get the listening ear of people who can make a difference. But also, it's not just getting the listening ear, it's also making them listen and then act on that. But then the short term is, if I am managing a setting where I know I've got staff vacancies, or if I'm that person that's thinking I could get better paid to go and do a job in my local supermarket that's got lovely working hours that I can fit around pick up and drop off, why am I doing this? Where or how are we going to find solutions in the short term to keep our industry? It might be an impossible question, but how are we going to, where can people look? What can we do that allows people to access or even just have their voice heard, so we know that they're finding like-minded people who appreciate the issue?
I think the hope, dare I say, is that at some point in time, and again, I'm trying to be non-political, but at some point in time, we will get colleagues in government, whichever political party that happens to be, but have a genuine interest for the well-being and see the long-term interests of investing in our youngest children. I always find it amazing that, I'm asked often, why should people who don't have children be paying for others, basically? And I always come back with the same answer, and that is that we never ask that question when a child hits the age of 5 or even 4 now and walks through the school gates. Somehow we wake up, everybody wakes up and realizes if we fail to get it right for that child, they will cost us billions further down the line. And yet anybody who knows anything about child development knows that the early years are the critical years in forming life chances. Government ministers know that, everybody knows it. But it needs somebody, again, as you've alluded to go, I'm not going to fall into the trap of being a mouthpiece for the Treasury. I am going to defend our children. I am going to make sure that the agenda for children moves up, basically. And I know people will say, and that means investment, but it also means mindset. So the hope is that we will at some point in time get the right people, dare I say, in place. I think there are a couple of other aspects that are probably critical. What we can do is appreciate our people. And I'm seeing more and more of that from colleagues who operate nurseries, preschools, etc., childminder groups. They're much more conscious about the well-being of their educators. They're much more conscious about the challenges that they face. And wherever possible, it's about flexibility. I go back to when I was younger and I was more motivated when my boss used to put his arm around me and say, you've done a fantastic job, Neil. And I do appreciate how you struggled or how you worked long hours to do this, more than somebody who completely ignored me, was not interested, and just perhaps gave me another £10 or whatever it happened to be. So at the moment in time, the only one thing I think that we can offer is that extension of love, dare I say, appreciating the goodwill that our people are giving to keep this sector afloat.
Yeah.
And that counts a lot. But there will come a point, and there has been a sort of crisis where when you're in a cost of living crisis and people are forced with having to pay their gas bill, their rent, their mortgage, put food on the table, the love that you have for what you're doing
Absolutely.
Aside.
It is, and it's about that. And as with everything we talk about these days, there is a post-COVID consequence to all of this as well, and not just on also the children that are walking through the door and where they are in terms of their development. Again, there's lots of interesting research, and we've talked about this before on this podcast, about how COVID has affected the development of children. But it's not just about that. It's about how it affected the practitioners, how it affected the parents. So there's a post-COVID legacy that impacts on all of this. When you've got the royal family who are really championing the kind of 0 to 5 space in a really high profile way, but yet it still doesn't impact on government policy. I think, what I would like to say to people is find your community. That's really important, both inside your workspace, especially if you're somewhere like a childminder who's childminding on your own. It can be a really lonely job and you've got a lot of pressure on you and a lot of responsibility, but find that community, and together those communities can also share the good bits. And it doesn't have to be just about, yes, it's difficult, but then people are coming up with little solutions, little wins all the time. And again, I think you're right in terms of the workforce. It's about that real appreciation of your team and what they do and letting them know that. And also hopefully the reciprocal bit of where if you're the manager or the person in charge, they also can let you know that they appreciate you, because that can also be quite a lonely position and quite a difficult one when you're trying to put all those jigsaw pieces in place in really an impossible jigsaw.
I agree entirely. I mean, we're at one.
Yeah, we are. I think in terms of, it's a government initiative. It's going to happen, like you said, whether we like it or not. The broad opinion is that we don't like it because it's ill-prepared, ill thought out, and we know there are going to be consequences that are not necessarily going to be positive. But yeah, with a lot of things that we have in education policy, at this moment in time, there's very little that we can do to change that finite decision. But it doesn't mean to say we can't have an influence on future. But what we can do as a workforce is come together as much as we possibly can. And, if we consolidate as a workforce and share the pain and the gain, then it might make that journey a little bit easier.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, we're coming to the end of that first podcast, Neil, and time has flown. It was a little bit of a dour way to end a podcast. But I think ultimately what we're saying is, for you and I have vast experience of the sector. We know that the sector is fundamentally built on passion, and it's built by people who really care about the development of small children that are ultimately going to be the policymakers of the future. So what we don't want to lose is that positive influence on the next generation, who are going to be the people that are our government and are our policymakers.
And I would say this, Alistair, is that sometimes I am criticised for, challenging initiatives, etc., and speaking out about the workforce. And I have had colleagues say to me, "Well, look, you'll never get people to come into the workforce if you paint a picture that is not exactly rosy." But I am constantly reminded of Bishop Desmond Tutu's quote, and I'm not sure this is word perfect, but along the lines of, "To remain neutral in an injustice is to be on the side of the oppressor." And I can't help feeling that for us to just shut up and say nothing and pretend everything is rosy, I'm pretty confident that nothing would be done. And I do wonder, well, what would it have been like had we not been challenging, had not been exposing? And I think we have to hang on to that basically at this point in time.
I think that's an excellent point and a fantastic way to end this episode. We have a voice, and collectively we should continue to use that voice, even if it feels like nobody's listening. I think you've got to keep chipping away, and eventually, with everything crossed, we're going to get there. So Neil Leitch, thank you very much for joining us for this podcast. For everybody else, tune in next time when Neil and I are going to be delving a little bit more into the early years workforce and how we can improve the perception of what we know is a really vital role for our children. Well, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to our guest, Neil, for joining us today and providing such valuable and interesting insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Alistair Bryce-Clegg, and Neil Leitch. Now, if you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and also access exclusive follow-up content, which includes ideas for your setting and links to relevant resources.